Tonight I'll read Chapter 12, The Harrows. The sound of Sam's sneeze seemed to echo around the room like a gunshot. Sam looked distraught, his eyes wide in the gloom. Emily stopped breathing. "What was that?" Sir Harold said loudly. "Is someone there?" Mrs. Harrow glared at him. "You fool!" she hissed. "You didn't search the room when we came in." Sir Harold started to say something in reply, then stopped himself. His face reddened under his white hair. Mrs. Harrow started to make her way through the maze of cabinets and bookcases towards the back of the room. "You may have to act decisively sooner than we thought," she said coldly. "Perhaps it was just a cat," suggested Sir Harold. Emily started breathing again and looked around frantically. Where could they go? It was only a matter of moments before Mrs. Harrow found their hiding place. Sam mimed pushing on the bookcase. Yes, thought Emily, push it over on the Harrows and then escape over the top. That might work. It had to. It was the only option. They braced themselves against the back wall and pushed against the bookcase with all their strength. To their despair, it was like pushing against a house. It didn't move at all. Or maybe it was something breaking, Sir Harold continued hopefully. These bookshelves are very old. Get a backbone, Harold, his wife said. Silencing these two will be the beginning of something glorious. Not for us, thought Emily angrily. Sam kept pushing against the bookcase, his face scarlet with the effort, but Emily knew it was hopeless. She leaned back against the wall. Through the gap in the books, she could see the Harrows had reached the other side of the bookcase that she and Sam were now hidden behind. Mrs. Harrow looked frustrated. "There's no one here," said Sir Harrow, his face pink with relief. "It must have been what I said, something breaking, wild goose chase." Emily's heart leapt. They'd got away with it, after all. Sam stopped pushing at the bookcase and grinned at her. "I don't think so," growled Mrs. Harrow. "See if there's a way around this bookcase. There might be a space behind it." Sam's face fell. He looked at Emily in desperation. Emily shook her head. Sam grimly picked up a heavy book and hefted it in his hand. There was a tiny creaking sound behind Emily, and she felt a draught of air on her skin. She turned in surprise. A vertical line of light had appeared behind the huge oil paintings, leaning against the wall to her right. Framed in the light was Miss Fairchild's anxious face. She had opened another door out of the room. "You know, there is a gap here at the end, between the bookcase and the wall," said Sir Harold. "Big enough for a child to get through." "Can you see them?" said Mrs. Harrow impatiently. "I know they're there. I can feel it." As quietly and quickly as they could, Emily and Sam squirmed behind the oil paintings. Miss Fairchild couldn't push the door open far because the paintings pressed against it at the top, but desperation spurred the children on, and they wriggled through the narrow gap into the room in moments. Miss Fairchild quietly closed the door behind them. Sam almost hugged Miss Fairchild. He was so relieved. Emily quickly put her ear to the door. She could imagine Sir Harold squeezing his head through the gap to look behind the bookcase. "No one here," she heard him say. He sounded relieved, too. "Impossible," barked Mrs. Harrow. "They must be there. Let me see." Emily was sure that she could hear Mrs. Harrow's harsh breathing. "These old buildings play tricks with sound," said Sir Harold. "I'm seeing and hearing those children everywhere," Mrs. Harrow grumbled. "The sooner we get them out of the way, the better. Adults I can handle. They do what they're told. But children just think they can do whatever they frogging want." Emily glanced behind her to see whether Miss Fairchild could hear any of this, but she was at the other end of the room, peering outside to see whether the Harrows had left yet. Mrs. Harrow's voice started to get fainter. They were obviously moving away from the door. "Harold," she said thoughtfully, "I think I know where we can catch them." Emily pressed her ear hard against the door, but frustratingly, Mrs. Harrow had moved her out of hearing range. She gave up and went to join Sam, who was hovering about near Miss Fairchild at the door. Miss Fairchild quietly closed the door. "Wait another few minutes. They've not left yet." "Thanks for saving us," said Sam. "I couldn't bear to get you into trouble with your head teacher," said Miss Fairchild. "I knew that you hadn't gone out because I hadn't seen you go past the counter. But it took me a few minutes to think of where you might be hiding, and remember that connecting door between the rooms." "We're very glad you did," said Sam, "because they're planning to—" Emily interrupted him. "When I was listening at the door," she said loudly, "I'm sure that I heard Mrs. Harrows say something about smelling smoke. Do you think you should check that everything's all right in there?" Miss Fairchild looked concerned. "Smoke? Are you sure?" Miss Fairchild frowned. "They haven't left the room. What on earth are they doing in there?" She went to the door and opened it. "Wait here." She marched straight to the Cotman room, knocked loudly twice, and then went straight in. Emily and Sam kept the door open a crack so they could listen. "Hello," she said. They heard her say. "Do you need any help?" Her voice trailed off. There were some unidentifiable mutterings from the Harrows. Then Miss Fairchild appeared wide-eyed at the door and yelled "Fire!" at the top of her lungs. Then she ran to the balcony edge and shouted down into the hallway, "Fire! Everyone out into the square immediately! Eggle, make sure everyone leaves and check the toilets." Eggle nodded and started to round people up. Behind her, the Harrows appeared in the doorway to the Cotman room, looking red-faced and angry. They started to sidle off towards the stairs. Miss Fairchild turned and looked at them fiercely. "Haven't you any idea at all, for Fry's sake?" She ran to a fire extinguisher nearby, detached it, and ran back into the Cotman room. In the meantime, the Harrows escaped down the stairs and out through the hall. Once the Harrows had left, Emily and Sam followed Miss Fairchild into the Cotman room. There was a cloud of choking smoke inside. Miss Fairchild had just finished blasting an area at the base of one of the bookcases with the extinguisher. She stepped back and wiped her forehead. "Got it in time," she said. "Thanks, Emily. I have no idea what those stupid people thought they were doing. When I came into the room, they were just standing watching the fire. Another couple of minutes and it would have been unstoppable." "Some people just freeze in a crisis," suggested Sam helpfully. "I read about it." Miss Fairchild nodded. "That is true, Sam. Anyway, you children need to leave the building until the fire boats get here." "Thanks for all your help, Miss Fairchild," said Emily. Miss Fairchild smiled. "Next time you come, Emily, I hope it's a little less exciting." "Me too," replied Emily sincerely. "Me too." And that is the end of chapter 12. Good night.